we want to establish our face sides. I'm going to engage one wheel at a time. If you do both, clamping it over the leg will ensure that you're going to get maximum force out of each mallet hit. The issue with adding it to the mortise is as you push the tenon in, glue can come out the top. Welcome to this Woodworking Skills for Beginners video with me, Sean Evelegh, where we're going to be cutting a through mortise and tenon. The tools you'll need are a rip saw, a crosscut saw, a router plane, a mortise chisel, a bevel edge chisel set, calipers, a marking gauge, a mortise gauge, a marking knife, a square, a rule, a pencil, a mallet, and some masking tape. A mortise and tenon joint is one of the most iconic joints in the world. It's used in furniture and it's also used in timber frame buildings. It's extremely strong, especially in the downward motion pushing on the joint. It's not as strong in the pulling motion because it hasn't got angled walls like a dovetail. However, it will last for generations. It will last as long as the glue holds up. Today we're going to be cutting a through mortise and tenon, which means the tenon is exposed on the other side of the board. This has no added strength, it's just more decorative than a standard mortise and tenon. So let's get cutting. You always mark the tenon first, but you cut the mortise first. So let's get marking. First, I want to mark the shoulder line around the whole edge of the tenon board. I want this to protrude around 4 millimeters. And I'm just going to mark that point there with my marking knife. Before we score the line all the way around the board, we want to establish our face sides. You want to pick the most decorative grain for this. I like the look of that. So I'm just going to mark a face, 2 face sides, like that. This way I know that all my measurements are going to be from the same face side, and if the boards haven't been planed perfectly square, it won't be an issue. So now I've got that little point from my knife, I'm going to get my marking knife, a square, and mark that line all the way around the board. I'm going to put the knife into that mark, slide the square up, and draw the line, doing a gentle scratch to begin with, and then going a bit harder. And you always want to reference the square off one of the face sides. If you don't do this, and you just keep on moving the square around the board, if the board is not parallel and not square, by the time you get all the way around, it's not going to meet up to that first, it's not going to line up to that first mark. It's going to be slightly off. So we've got that shoulder line marked all the way around the board. Now you want to put it in your vise and mark out the tenon. Now your tenon always has to be the same size as your mortise chisel because that's what you're cutting the mortise with. Now it's a good idea to get a set of these so then you can choose what size tenon you want. Today I've got an 8mm mortise chisel and I've already set it up to the thickness of that chisel. And I'm going to eyeball that into the center of the board. I'm going to engage one wheel at a time. If you do both, it's a lot harder and you're more likely to get an inaccurate mark. So just focus on one cutter at a time, gradually getting deeper. Like that. So we've marked the width of the tenon, now we want to mark the length. The easiest way to do that is with some calipers, and I roughly want a 5mm shoulder on either side, and I'm just going to punch a hole in either side there. And you want to keep the calipers set to this position because we'll transfer that over to the mortise board. Now with a pencil and a square, I'm going to carry on those lines. I'm also going to bring these lines down the face of the board. That's going to help me cut perfectly straight. I find it helpful doing these lines all the way around the board, because as you're cutting, you should constantly look around the board to make sure you're cutting straight in all directions. And I'm bringing these lines all the way down to the mark and gauge line. Okay, so we've got the tenon marked out. Now it's time to mark out the mortise. So I'm going to use these calipers that are still set to the measurement of the tenon. I'm just going to make a mark in this board. This is more accurate than using a ruler, because if you're using a pencil, you can always be slightly off the millimeter. But now I've got two definite marks that I can put the pencil into and draw that line. Now I know the lines are in the exact right position. And then to mark the width of the tenon, again, I'm going to use my mortise gauge. Remember to reference off the face edge. I'm going to engage one wheel at a time. Good thing about a wheel marking gauge is you can roll up to that line. On this side, it doesn't matter if you go past because you've got a shoulder that's hiding it. But on the show face where the tenon's going to protrude, you definitely don't want to go over, because you'll see that marking gauge line in the end result. So I've got that marked out. I'm going to carry on these lines to the front of the board. And instead of me bringing the second line all the way around, I'm going to use my calipers again, because that's going to give me a more accurate secondary line. I'm going to go back to the pencil, put that in that hole, and mark a straight line. Going to go back to my mortise gauge, again referencing off the face edge, and mark that line. Got to be very careful here because this is the show face. You don't want to go too far. There we go. So now the tenon has been marked, the mortise has been marked, it's time to cut it out. So I'm going to clamp this to the workbench. You can clamp it in a few different ways, but I recommend clamping it directly over the leg of your workbench because you're going to be hitting down quite hard. If you do it in the center of your workbench, you can get more vibrations, and clamping it over the leg will ensure that you're going to get maximum force out of each mallet hit, because it's going to be going into the leg of that workbench. Okay, so I've got my mortise chisel and I'm going to sight down the length of the timber. This is the best way to look at your chisel when you're chiseling. If you're side on, you won't know if your chisel is angled, and it's going to go and not go in straight. So you want to make sure you're looking down the length of the board, making sure your chisel is completely straight. And I'm going to start off in the middle, doing little taps to begin with. You want to go about 5 millimeters from this line. If you go too close, you're going to end up bruising the wall, because you do use a lot of this material to prise up all that waste, and you'll end up bruising that line and going beyond it. So you keep this on until the very end. And when you're cutting mortises, this can be quite a messy joint, and you'll end up bruising all of the surrounding material. That's not an issue, because the shoulder of the tenon is going to hide all of that. The other side needs to be a lot prettier. You can see I'm levering the chisel back, which is bruising these walls here. That's okay, because we haven't gone right to that line yet. This is a slow process. You want to take little bits at a time. If you rush it, then you'll end up messing up the inside of the joint too much. And you can always use a smaller chisel to help you remove the waste, or even a drill. You can use a drill bit to hog away most of the material quickly. But if you want it to be a hand cut joint, maybe a drill is not the best thing. So I'm just using a ruler here to measure how deep I'm going. You definitely don't want to go too far and break through the other side. I'm leaving about 3 to 4 millimeters until the bottom. And before I flip it over, I'm going to pare back to those marking lines. Okay, so I've cut as much out of the mortise as I can. I'm going to flip it over and start going from the other side. Now you don't want to use a mortise chisel here because this can leave really rough edges and you might go over the marking gauge line. So I'm going to switch to some bevel edge chisels, and because it's just the remaining couple millimeters of the joint, it's not going to matter if it's not square or anything. You just want a really clean shoulder. So I'm going to punch through the middle with this tiny chisel, like that. And keep on creeping back until I meet the line. You've got to be very delicate here. If you take too much off, it can rip the surrounding grain. So you want to really nibble it. And you want to use a smaller chisel than the size of the mortise, because if you're slightly off or your chisel's bent, then it can bruise the walls. You want to do all the cross grain first and creep up to that corner, and then you do with the grain, because it can really tear if you do with the grain first. Now I'm going to go to a larger chisel, because I'm now going with the grain. You can see how using the bevel edge chisel has left a really clean mortise compared to the mortise chisel. So you want to make sure you do this on the inside. That's going to be hidden with the shoulder, and then the bit of the tenon that's exposed is going to be clean with the bevel edge chisel. So now that mortise is cut, I'm going to head over to the vise. So now to cut the tenon. You can do this with a Japanese saw or a Western saw. You want to use a rip saw, and I'm going to go slightly off the line, leaving maybe 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter gap. If you cut on the line, that's very risky, and you could end up cutting the tenon too small, or when you're cutting the mortise, you may have accidentally made that too big, therefore you get a loose joint. So you want to go over, and then you can fine tune it to fit perfectly in the mortise. Now I'm going to change to a crosscut saw to remove the waste If you don't have a crosscut saw, you can use your rip saw for this. Again, I'm going to go off the line because I'm going to pare back to that marking gauge line with a chisel. So now that tenon is oversized and is about 1 millimeter oversized all the way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pare back these short sides with just a chisel, and I'm going to flatten these larger faces with a router plane. So the length of the tenon is the right size now. Now I'm going to use the router plane, taking little bits of material off at a time. Just checking the measurements. It's a good idea to clamp this to your workbench so it doesn't slide around. If you take too much off with your router plane, because of the bevel of the blade, it can actually be too aggressive and dig into the tenon and then take away too much material. So you want to nibble small bits at a time. And I'm using this other block as support on the other side so it doesn't tip. Still a bit too tight, so I'm going to take off a tiny bit more. So that joint is fitting snugly now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp it to the workbench again and use some chisels to clean up that shoulder. I'm going to clamp it above the leg of the workbench again so I don't get any vibrations when hammering. And I'm going to halve the material. I'm going to keep on halving until there's a tiny amount left that I can put the chisel into that marking line and then pare down. You want to do that with the largest chisel you have to get the straightest line possible. Now I'm going to bring it over to the bench vise to add a slight undercut. So you want to see a white line all the way around your piece of wood. That is your marking gauge line. You don't want to start the chisel lower than that. You want to rest it on, angle the handle up so you're cutting slightly downwards on the inside of the board. You don't want to go lower than the line on the outside. The reason you want to go slightly inwards is because you don't want any high spots that is going to prevent the joint from fully seating, and it will show up as a gap in the final joint. You want these outer walls to be touching all the way around. Now it's time to test fit it. So I'm lining up the face sides. There we go. That's come out nicely. All the shoulders have seated correctly, and there's no gap around the tenon. So yeah, what I'm going to do now is take it apart, add the glue, and that is the joint complete. So that shoulder is all clean now, and it's time to add a chamfer on the top of the tenon. This is a really nice decorative feature you can add for exposed through mortise and tenons. So now it's time to glue the through mortise and tenon. Now, there's different ways of adding glue. You can just add it to the tenon, you could just add it to the mortise, you could do both. The issue with adding it to the mortise is as you push the tenon in, glue can come out the top. And if you haven't pre-finished this surface or pre-finished the end of the tenon, then it's going to be very difficult to remove that glue after. So I like to just apply it to the tenon, and as I push it through, I won't have any squeeze out on this show face. Again, I'm going to want to add glue all around the shoulder, because if there are any gaps, that will fill it. Remember not to put any glue on the top of the tenon, otherwise that would be difficult to remove. Now you can't add just one clamp onto the top because you'll just be clamping down the tenon. You need to clamp the surrounding material to really push it down. So I'm going to add a clamp. On either side of the tenon. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave this to set for an hour, and then we'll take out the clamps and have a look. So that is a through mortise and tenon. I'm a big fan of this joint. I think the chamfer on the top of the tenon makes a big difference. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Remember to like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.